One of the biggest obstacles when creating your comic is knowing just where to start. Fortunately, I have a few ideas that can help spark that imagination and get that ball rolling. Greetings everyone, welcome to the underground lair where we bring our creations to life. I'm Scott with Serkworks Art Labs. I'm a professional illustrator, designer, and mad creator because you know what? It helps to be a little crazy when you do this thing called art. And another thing that can be kind of maddening is starting your comic. I get comments from people all the time saying, I just don't know how to start. I don't know where to begin. I don't know how to come up with ideas for my story. Well, fortunately, I have a few ideas that I think are going to help you in that department. I think the reason so many people have a hard time getting started on their comic or really any creative project is just staring at that blank page. It can be really intimidating because although you have endless possibilities, sometimes it helps to narrow things down a little and give you a little bit of a structure. So while that blank page can be overwhelming, what if you had a sandbox to play in? Now imagine that sandbox is just filled with other people's toys. You know, when I was a kid, when I was growing up, I played with Star Wars and He-Man and all that. I had tons of cool toys and I'd play with my friends and everything, and we'd come up with all kinds of adventures and things for our figures and far out worlds and things that we created. But the thing is, we never really acted out the movies as they were. You know, Star Wars, we didn't usually take a scene from Star Wars and interact and recreate it the way it was. We came up with our own stories using those characters, and it was a lot of fun. So when you think back to when you were a kid, you probably did the same thing, no matter, maybe you didn't grow up in the 80s like I did, it wasn't Star Wars, maybe it was Ghostbusters, or maybe it was, you know, Transformers, or maybe it was something else, I don't know, but you probably play with toys and came up with all these cool stories, and you didn't really worry about it. You weren't like, oh, I don't know how to play or how to come up with ideas. So kind of put yourself in that position of the way it was when you were a kid, because and having an opportunity to have all these other characters that are already sort of predefined, but you can kind of tell your own stories with those. That's a little bit what I want to talk about today. Now, you can't really use Star Wars or He-Man or Transformers because they're sort of licensed characters and everything, and they are owned by other companies, unless you have an official license to do that. And if you do, you're probably a working artist and you've probably found ways to be creative and get things out. It's usually, sometimes it's the people that are just starting off, not all the time. I mean, I still have trouble coming up with ideas sometimes too, but these are some techniques that I think will really help you, and they help me too. So while you probably can't use Star Wars and all that kind of stuff, there are tons of public domain characters out there, and things just from history and everything that you can dive into and play around with and reinvent and come up with new ideas and new stories for. There are some really awesome and interesting characters in the public domain. Characters like Zorro and Sherlock Holmes, King Arthur, who else? Robin Hood. There's tons of these characters, and people have done so many different interpretations, and you can add your own interpretation onto those characters as well. And there's always new characters coming into the public domain. Just recently, very recently, Winnie the Pooh came into the public domain. Now, the one thing you have to realize when you are working with public domain characters is you can only draw from the original source material. You can't really add to anything that somebody else created that adds on to that. For instance, with like Winnie the Pooh, Disney came up with the red shirt, and they redesigned those characters to be a little more cartoony. In the original stories, they were pretty much like little stuffed animals. So you can go back to that sort of that classic Pooh look, and you can, you know, tell stories that way. Same thing with like, say, Wizard of Oz or Alice in Wonderland. It's a good idea to know exactly what people added after the fact that weren't in those original stories, so that you're not taking something that is trademarked by somebody else. For instance, in the Wizard of Oz, you can't really use the ruby slippers because those were added later by MGM. In the original book, they were silver shoes. So you can do that, but you got to be a little careful with stuff like that. but there is just a wealth of great characters and storytelling that you can dive into some of those old stories. And it doesn't stop with just these public domain characters in in historical books and everything. Comics have their own lengthy, there were so many pre-Golden Age stuff that's in the public domain. There were so many characters out there that are out there right now that are just prime for the picking. Just look at some of them, and it's kind of fun. Some of them, they're kind of iffy or whatever, but sometimes it's fun to reinvent and there's something there I kind of like. I can kind of tweak that and give it my own flair and everything. A good place to go to for something like this is a website called Comic Book Plus, and hopefully I'll remember to leave a link in the description. But go there. There's tons of public domain stories, characters that are in the public domain, comic books, superheroes, things like that you can dive into and use and make your own stories with if you're having trouble kind of coming up with your own character. Another area is mythology, and there are so many great mythological stories that you can look into. Greek and Roman mythology, Norse mythology, every culture has its own mythology that you can dive into, and there's just some amazing stories, and you don't have to tell them as if they were taking place back when these stories were written. There are so many modern stories that are based on Homer's Odyssey, and so it's just a matter of, a great story is a great story. You can change the setting and everything. I'm thinking, and this isn't necessarily in the public domain, but like Seven Samurai, Kurosawa's Seven Samurai has been told so many different styles, or so many different ways, in so many different styles. It's been told as a Western, it's been told as a war story. Even Bug's Life was based on Seven Samurai. Another one is Battle Beyond the Stars. It was this Roger Corman space story told as if it was the Seven Samurai. So you can take these stories and just change things around and make them unique. In addition to mythology, think of legends and fables and fairy tales. This is a really cool book. It's called The Skillful Huntsman, and it is based on a Grimm's fairy tale. But again, it's basically a concept book for a movie that was never made, or never probably intended to be made. But I think it was like a school project for one of the art schools. And as you can see, all these designs, it's sort of a futuristic fantasy story, but it's based on this Grimm fairy tale. So think of different settings you can place these stories into that are atypical, or a different setting that would actually happen when the story was written. Obviously Disney is excellent at taking these fairy tales and adding their own spin to it. If you read some of the original, like Mermaid or Beauty and the Beast, they didn't really have names. It wasn't Ariel in the original story. It wasn't Belle. They didn't really have names. It was just, the story was The Little Mermaid, and they added all this personality to them, and they added all these ancillary characters and stuff that weren't in the original fairy tales. The original fairy tales were pretty sparse, and they didn't always end well. They had Disney added their happy ending to it, because in the original fairy tale, I think the Little Mermaid turned into sea foam, and it was a very sad story. And that's a story that, now that with Disney so popular, a lot of people don't even realize the original. So maybe tell that darker version. You can go darker. You can go the opposite of Disney and go darker instead of more of a happy ending type of thing. You can go even darker than the originals if that's something you want to do. So just think of different takes that you can add to some of these great stories that are out there. I'm pretty sure that in Snow White, I don't think the dwarfs had their own. I don't think they had names. I think it was, again, I think Disney went and added all the personality to the dwarfs and everything. So in the vein of The Skillful Huntsman, where they took more of a fantasy, futuristic story, you could do that with Snow White as well. Maybe it's not Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. Maybe it's Snow White and the Seven Droids. I think droids, maybe, that's probably trademark Star Wars. But you know what I mean? Maybe it could be a futuristic setting, and there's these robots that come and help her or whatever. You can do all kinds of things, but it gives you sort of the blueprint when you take from some of these existing stories using existing characters. Another area that's great for getting ideas from are just actual historical events, and you can fictionize these. Historical fiction is a great genre, and so imagine the movie The Titanic, James Cameron's Titanic. All the events were pretty close to what happened, but the characters involved, there were some realistic characters, but he created, Jack and Rose, and they kind of interacted with some of these actual characters throughout history. So you can create your own characters and weave them through historical events, or even, you could do that with a fairy tale. You could add different characters that kind of jump into this fairy tale, and I mean, the more I talk about this, the more I'm starting to get my own ideas on, I might want to do something like that. That's the great part about using some of these existing stories. Some of my personal favorite characters that are in the public domain and stories are like the horror stories, like Frankenstein and Dracula, or you can go into like Edgar Allan Poe or H.P. Lovecraft. I mean, there's so many great things in there, and you've seen a lot of these different interpretations, but kind of maybe add your own. And don't be afraid to combine some of these different stories. I mean, you could make Sherlock Holmes one public domain character and Dracula, and have Sherlock Holmes meets Dracula. Or there was a popular author, I don't remember the author's name, but he's the one that did like Pride and Prejudice and Zombies, and he also did Abraham Lincoln Vampire Hunter, taking these existing public domain stories and flipping them on their end and throwing zombies into the mix and everything. So the possibilities, I mean, your imagination is limitless. Sometimes it just takes something to spark that imagination. And I think diving into existing characters, existing stories that are in the public domain, I think that is just the way to go if you're having trouble coming up with ideas and generating stories, or just staring at that blank page. Instead of that blank page, think of it as a sandbox. Think of all these toys, which are the public domain and legends and historical figures and all this stuff that exists that you have free access to, and just take some of these classic stories and play with them and run with them. And I think you're going to come up with all kinds of ideas. Like I said, the wheels in my head are already turning with some of the great ideas that I can come up with using some of these great historical stories, fiction, public domain as sort of a blueprint, and just see where I can go with that. Anyway, that's all I have to talk about today. I will see you guys later. That is all. Hey, thanks for watching. If you like what you saw and you want to see more, hit that subscribe button. Also, you can follow me at Serkworks on social media, and now you can support the work that I do on Patreon. Do you like making comics? Then go to Serkworks.com and pick up the Comic Maker Starter Kit. It's packed full of fonts, brushes, templates, and more. And best of all, it's totally free.